estimating software, success through measuring. This goes back to the old idea that if you want to improve something, you got to measure it, because if you're not measuring it, you don't know how to improve it. And software is definitely something we write a lot of, so we want to be able to improve it. We want to get better at how we do it. That's part of becoming a better developer. So primarily our goal of estimation is what we're going to get started with. Why would we even care, basically? And then we're going to move into, what are some ways to estimate software? And some of these will, or maybe all of them will be familiar. Hopefully we'll take a little bit of a different bent on how these things work. Talk about some of the pros and cons of each of them, because sure enough, whatever way you use to measure it, there are some pros and cons to it. And then we're going to talk about what do you do after that? Once you've sort of figured out what you're going to do as far as like, how are you going to measure it? And then you measure it. Well, how do you get better? Well, then you go in and you're going to review what your measurements were. Are you getting better? Are you getting worse? Is it going the direction you want it to? You make your adjustments and you repeat the exercise. So your goals in estimation, probably most people, the thing that's going to jump out the most is going to be for really number 1 and 3 here. The top and the third bullet there are proper planning and setting expectations. You estimate because your boss comes to you and says, how long is it going to take you to do X? And you say, it's going to take me 3 days. And so they walk away and they're going to expect 3 days later, if they say, go ahead and do it, then you're going to come back with some result. So that's the simplest way to look at it. And if you make it in 3 days, then you're successful. If it takes you 4 days, then they're going to say, hey, it took you longer than you estimated. And that may be a problem, or it may not be. It may be one of those where you can say, well, I'd never even done this before, so I just sort of picked a number out of the air. Or you can say, well, I've done this before, but this time something different happened, stuff like that. But along with all of this, I think the thing that gets lost actually the most is improving the implementation process is a real important reason to estimate at all, is because each time you do something, if you've got some estimates and then you do a postmortem and you look back at what happened, you're going to see either you were good with your estimates or you weren't. And weren't could be that you actually come in early. Maybe you get everything done. You estimated 3 months and you get the project done in 2. Or it could be you estimate 3 months and you get the project done in 4. Both of those cases, your estimation was way off. In one, you're sort of happy that it was off, probably, but maybe not. I mean, there's some cases where if you plan for 3 months of work and it all gets done in 2 months, then you may have people twiddling their thumbs for a month doing nothing, basically. And so you've essentially wasted some resources. Along with that is measuring the progress. You want to be able to, if you can do, which is admittedly very difficult, if you can do an apples to apples comparison of project to project to project, and you can see where the project you did 5 years ago and now the one you just did last year are sort of the same, then using some good estimation and tracking around that, measuring your progress on it, hopefully you're doing better than you were. Hopefully you got better at doing that job than you did a few years ago. And that is something about software, is although there's a minimum amount of time required to get some stuff done, depending on what the tasks are. It's just, it takes time to create or generate code. However, as we get better at it, we will get better and faster at generating that code, whether that's just us knowing off the top of our head and we're able to maybe type a little faster and we don't have to think about it as much, or maybe we've got tools that we've built or scripts that we've got that help us through some of that, code generators, things like that. It's just the sort of the nature of the beast is that however long it takes you to code a solution today, coding that same solution next year, you should be able to do it in less time and thus potentially less cost. So that's something we want to see. That's part of becoming a better developer. Whoops, go the wrong way. So first we'll talk about some of the estimation options. The most brute force-ish thing I think you could do just about as far as coding is concerned is try to measure lines of code. Just how many, I guess you could go more than that. You could say characters of, like characters that they've entered as opposed to lines of code, and try to get even more granular and a little bit harder to put numbers to it. You can take it up a level and you have functions. So or methods or something like that, or some sort of relative piece of logic. And then you're actually grouping the lines of code, but also that means that if somebody writes logic really well to solve a problem, and they can do it in 2 lines of code, then they don't get dinged by the guy that's not as smart that takes them 10 lines of code. And you can sort of go up from there, as you can just drive it based on like tasks or tickets or something like that. If you're running a maintenance, sort of like a support desk, and there's a certain amount of, there's tickets that are coming in to go do things in the code to maintain it, then you can measure, hey, I got 2 tickets done or 5 tickets done. You could also do tasks like if you use a Kanban board or something like that with the Agile approach, where you've got, things that need to be done, and you just base your progress on, how many things did I get done this week? I think you can also just go straight hours. I worked 40 hours this week. Or I worked 60 hours this week. So all of those are ways to estimate software. And there's some other things, but more or less you're going to find they probably break down into those areas. So let's look at lines of code first. Lines of code is actually easy to measure. There are counters all over the place that you can jump into you can probably just about open a file in any editor, and you can see how many lines of code exist in that file. And so you can get that kind of stuff off of your version control a lot. You can see how many lines changed and some things like that. So it's maybe a little bit of work, but for the most part, it's pretty easy to measure. That if you have a file that's got 100 lines of code in it, or if you have a method that had 100 lines of code in it, that you created 100 lines of code. The problem with it is easy to manipulate. So I could throw some comments in there, or I could make sure that every time I start an if statement, I add a new line, or I could instead of declaring 3 variables in 1 line, I'm going to declare those variables in 3 lines. So you can do a lot. If your goal is to generate a lot of lines of code, there are a lot of things you can do to do that, including like don't have any loops. Anywhere that you're going to do like a for while loop or a counting loop where you're going to do something 10 times, you're going to loop it and run through it. Well, instead of that, just write that, whatever that section of code is, write that out 10 times. Boom. Suddenly you've got a lot of lines of code that you've been generating. Another con is it's really hard to estimate how useful this is, because are the lines of code you're writing good code, bad code, mediocre code? Does it even get executed? Does it cause errors? What is it? Does it save lives? I don't know. And you don't, from counting lines of code, you have no idea what the value of that is. And honestly, which is why I don't think we see it very often anymore, is that it sort of sends the wrong message. If your metric is lines of code, then the metric is, I don't really care what you're writing, just as long as you're writing. It's like at that point you're the whole idea of the infinite number of monkeys and an infinite number of typewriters kind of things. They just want you to be another monkey on a typewriter just banging stuff out, and there's no other value around it. So that's lines of code. Not a lot of pros to it, other than it, like I said, it is easy to throw in a spreadsheet or something like that and to see, hey, I wrote 1,000 lines of code yesterday. I wrote 1,200 lines of code today. Then hey, I'm writing more code. So moving on to the next one is functions. Again, functions are pretty easy to measure, because in the same way, especially now when you look at object-oriented languages and a lot of the IDEs, they'll actually do a little like project summary or tree view of the code, so you can see the methods or the functions that are in that file. You can do counters. There's a lot of tools, little scripts in that you can do that you could pretty quickly count the number of methods or functions that are in files across a folder, or even recurse down through a folder structure. Function points or the function-based stuff is a little better than code or just counting lines of code, because although it can be manipulated when you design, it really can't be by the coder themselves. So for example, in the design point of view, you could make it so that pretty much every line of code was a function. It would be a really slow, probably annoying application to deal with, but you could have all kinds of functions and it would blow up really fast. You could also have just a couple of functions that have thousands and thousands of lines of code in them. So depending on what you do, the design is actually going to dictate to some extent how many functions and how complex those functions are. If you do it right, if the design is done well, then as a pro, function point is actually a fairly realistic metric, because at the end of the day, what matters is that your app does a laundry list of things. And each of those things is probably a function. And maybe underneath that, there's some functions that roll up to that primary function. Like, function, like what an app does is it allows the user to log in, allows the user to log out, allows the user to change a password, allows the user to, enter their favorite football team, allows the user to enter the scores of their football team over the last year. Those are all function points. Those are functions that it would do, and at some point that's going to translate back to some code. So those kinds of things, if you're coding towards your functions, that means you are coding towards, and if as part of that is proper code review and they test successfully and things like that, well then hey, you're doing good. You're moving towards your actual goal of producing useful software. I guess it's a good time to mention as well that each of these measurement types can include or not properly tested and reviewed code and some things like that. There's some other things around just the pure coding part of it that you can use to sort of validate that the work has been done properly. And although we're not really going to talk about those much, those are highly recommended. If whatever you're going to do, there should be some checks and balances in it to make sure that people aren't just essentially just banging on keyboards. One of the problems with functions is that they can be inconsistent. I've already alluded to this, where you could have, as part of design, there may be functions like getters and setters. I can crank out getters and setters all day. I could put thousands and thousands of them together. But a function to, launch a satellite into space, that one's going to be a little more complicated. That's going to take some work. So there can be some inconsistencies there. And a good example of this, years ago, I was at a company that they actually, as part of motivating the developers, there was a bonus program. I don't remember what you were paid, but it was based on functions. So the number of functions that you coded, per day or per week, they would add it up and you'd get I can't remember what, like a buck a function or something like that. But it was interesting because one of the developers that I worked with, all they were doing was building just like the core pieces of a user interface. Those core pieces essentially was like a point, a square, a triangle, a circle, some shapes and stuff like that. So it was all these classes, and every one of them, they had a couple values, but then they had some getters and they had some setters, and they had an output to the console and an output to string and a save and a load, which are usually like, 2-line functions. So they could knock out 100 functions in a couple hours. They could easily just crank through that stuff, not even using code generators or anything. But then, so this person, they were working a system, and they managed to get some nice little bonuses along the way before the management figured out what they had essentially roped themselves into. Whereas there's the first couple of times I was in there, I was just sort of just blindly doing all these functions. I looked in, I was like, I'm getting 3 or 4 done a day, and I look over the list of what these other people are doing. I'm like, oh, I need to write more getters and setters so I can, bump my count up. So sometimes you could, code yourself a new car, I guess, if you got a really good, bonus program set up that way. The function point stuff it can add some overhead too. It can be a little, since it's not as, although there are tools to count it, it can be relatively easy to measure. There's definitely some overhead around that as well, that you have to make sure that part of that measuring, are they complete functions? Are they not? There's some things like that it's functions. It's a little bit more of a line of code is a line of code. A function sometimes is not a function. Maybe it's really just like a static block of code or something like that that could be empty. You could have an empty function. Is it a function? Maybe, but maybe not. So there's some things like that in evaluating that and using that as a metric that you have to think through. And so then there's a little bit of overhead there to make sure that you're actually getting a valid count, whatever it is that you've decided to declare a function. Tasks and tickets. Again, this is one that it's very, it has to be very customer or priority centric, because either a customer called in and created that ticket essentially, or if it's like an agile project, then a manager or designer or somebody said, this is something we've got to do. And so that got, ended up moving its way into a ticket. So as far as getting something done that's got some value to it, the task ticket approach is pretty darn good. It does allow a little bit of manipulation depending on how you set it up, because you may have self-selection or you may have assignment, and that would be by the people that are working on it. So if I'm getting evaluated based on the number of tickets that I can get done in a given week or whatever time period, and if I'm allowed to look to select which task I'm going to do, I'm going to pick the easiest, quickest task left and right. I'm going to do whatever I can and if I can grab 10 at a time, I'm going to grab 10 at a time. I'm going to suck up all of the easy to use tasks, and I'm going to leave the nasty ones for the person next to me. If you did an assignment, then if the manager assigns stuff out or a lead or something like that, well, it's probably going to be a little more fair if they use some sort of a round robin process or something where they just sort of work, they just randomly work their way through it. But there's also, like the suck up factor and stuff like that maybe it's, everybody knows that the manager is going to hand out their tasks. And so you're going to make sure best you can to, butter them up so they give you the easier ones to do. That, of course, leads to, this can be pretty inconsistent. A ticket could be something simple like correct this spelling error, or it could be something, pretty substantial like make the app HIPAA compliant. Those could both be valid tickets. Those are tickets I've seen in the past. There's a huge different amount of work that goes into those. So if you're being evaluated based on just pure number of tickets, then you're going to have some issues. Now, a good way that a lot of people adjust that is some sort of like a sizing or a ranking of tickets. So you have maybe like a tickets from, on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being huge, 1 being very tiny. And then when you combine that with the idea of like a 1 being something you can get done in an hour typically, 2 being something maybe you can get done in 2 hours, 3 you can get in maybe 3 to 4 hours, 4 you can get in a day, 5 it's going to take you more than a day, something like that. If you've got sort of a scale that goes with your ranking, so that you have almost like points per ticket, so it's a 1 point or a 5 point ticket or 10 point or however you do it, then you can start actually getting some more consistency. You can sort of get around the fact that the requests themselves are possibly going to be highly inconsistent. And as we talked about, this can be manipulated, the way those tasks work and whether or not you create subtasks or not. It does get back into something actually we've talked about the past, about the idea of having a to-do list and the idea of like creating an item that says create a to-do list, or you get something done and then you go in and you write a task down to say get that done, even though you just got it done. You're just trying to stroke your ego or whatever by saying, hey, I got something done, or impress by somebody by saying, hey, look at how long my list was, versus actually getting stuff accomplished. Hours of effort. This, I would think, is it's probably the easiest to measure. The challenge is it's the hardest to verify. And anybody that's spent any time in an office where, unless, and there's not too many I've been in where, unless everybody's like comes in, sits at their desk, and there's no interaction or anything like that, they don't leave their desk until lunchtime, and then they grab a quick lunch and they, leave it in at the end of the day. That almost never happens. Mostly what happens is you get in there and you do some work for a while, but then somebody gives you a call, or somebody walks up, or you got to, run to the bathroom, and then the next thing you know, you got a conversation in a hallway that somebody passed by, or there's somebody at the cube next to you that has a conversation you get sucked into. The hours that you're actually there are not the hours you work. Now you can work with that. You can try to get more validity to them by using like the Pomodoro technique or something like that, where you do basically say, all right, we're only going to measure like heads down doing work hours. And that kind of stuff will help. You still have to make sure that, that's still, there's a little bit of an honesty there as well. Cause you're saying, hey, all right, if you say you're going to sit down and, go heads down for 25 minutes working on something important, then I assume that means you're going to sit there for 25 minutes working on something important, and not spend 5 minutes working on something important and then, spend 15 minutes, writing an email out to your girlfriend or something like that. And hours of effort, you can lose the focus on what you're really supposed to do. This is, again, I saw this a lot in, it's probably because it is a young person's game. When you're younger, you're down in your 20s or even your early 30s, maybe even in your late 30s, depending on how, what your situation is. Hours, you can put in a lot of hours of work. Physically, it's not that big a deal. It's okay for you to get up, have a long day, and maybe work on the weekend, stuff like that. Not necessarily productive, but you can put in a lot of hours. And if the company or the management approach is we're looking at the number of hours that you're in the office, then that's your incentive is to stick around the office as much as possible. That can be detrimental. I mean, to the point where people just be like, well, they're just going to hang out, and just make sure that they're seen. And I've run into stories of this over the years where, like, somebody makes sure that they're like the first one in the office. So when management comes in, they see that person sitting in their seat, and then they wait till management leaves, and that's, then they can finally go home, because they want to be seen every time that, the management walks by in the office. That doesn't mean they do anything in between those two times. That just means they get there early and leave late. And pouring hours into something is not necessarily productive either. There's a lot of times that, you're better off take a 20-minute break and walk off and do something else for a while, and, just not think about that problem, and you'll come back and find yourself being more productive, and maybe you'll, suddenly have that, the solution will come to you. Hours of effort does require some overhead administration. I mean, whether it's, somebody that's like they're sort of watching people, or whether people are having to like have a time clock or something like that, or whether they're clicking buttons to say, hey, I'm starting work. Hey, I'm done with work. Whether they need to like write something down at the end of the day and go, oh yeah, I worked 6 hours today, or 7 hours a day, or 15 hours today. And then, that's got reported up and all that kind of stuff. So there's a little bit of overhead administration to that usually falls on the actual workers themselves, and not, you can have some tools that'll do that, especially if people use like ID cards to get into the workplace and some things like that. But again, it's not very often I've found that they actually use that to tie it back to hours of work that people have done. As I mentioned, it's not a real measure of productivity. You can be staring at a screen for hours and get nothing done. We talked about that earlier in this meeting, actually, where sometimes you just hit a roadblock and you're not making progress. You're just banging your head against a brick wall, and you struggle for a while. And then eventually, you'll get through it, because then there's also going to be days where you're just like everything is falling in place. Every line of code you write is perfect the first time. There's no typos, all that kind of stuff. And you spend only a couple hours, but you get a whole lot done. And that's the magical, morning and evening a lot of people know. Or if you get in, you go to work between usually about 6 a.m. to about 8:30 in most offices, you can get a whole lot of work done, more than you can get probably the rest of the day. And if you stay later at night, depending on where you're at, 5:30, 6:30 at night, and something later than that, you're gonna get a whole lot of stuff done because there's just less distractions. So our actual hours that you put in, it's not always a great measure of productivity. More importantly, in the developer world, the hours that are put in is widely different from developer to developer. There have been studies where developers that are like a junior level are as much as 10 times less productive than those that are at like a mid to senior level, and maybe even more than that, because there's just a compound of like skills and ability and done this before and all the kinds of things that go into being a mid-level or senior level developer that makes them dramatically more productive than junior developers. And if you look at it in a lot of projects, and I've seen this a lot over the years, where if you were in a situation where you could take, let's say, 2 or even 3 junior developers, and salary wise and cost wise, it was going to cost as much as one senior developer. In almost every instance, you would be way ahead on money to take the senior developer over the juniors. And that is, part of where the problem is. If you are a junior developer, when you're getting into it, you've got people that, even with a few years more experience than you, they're going to be quite a bit more productive. So you're essentially in a situation where you're asking somebody to trust you, or to invest in you a little bit, or to be patient with you in a little bit. And there are, it is something that pays off. Not to name names, but I will pick on Timothy a little bit. Is that, he was somebody that had very little experience the first time I hired him, and it was just in talking to him, and where I said, this is somebody that we want to work with for a long time, because we know that he's going to be a little slow now, but he's going to get better fast, and it will pay for it. He will pay for himself in the long run, which is what you're supposed to do as an employee anyways. So, it's sort of bad news for the junior developers, good news maybe for the more senior people. And I guess it's good news for the juniors to say that, hey, it's a struggle early on, but once you get a couple of years into it, you will see that your productivity will increase dramatically. And so the stuff that it takes you a lot of time and a lot of effort to get through, it does get a lot easier. It's not that there are no problems anymore, but you will find that on a regular day, you'll start cranking through stuff. And there is that satisfaction of getting something done, where it took you weeks maybe to get something done, where you could see the fruits of your labor when you're early on. As you get into senior levels of stuff, you're in situations where the projects you're doing, the type of work you're doing, and how you do it, you can see the fruits of your labor in hours. And that's always real cool when you're like, man, I started this morning, I had nothing, and look what I got here. And you can see that, wow, there is some pretty powerful stuff out there. So hours of effort, really difficult. You have to almost put modifiers in there, or do an apple to apple comparison of developers of, maybe I'm only whatever, I'm going to grade the hours that the juniors put in, and I'm going to grade the hours that the mid-levels put in a little different, and the seniors a little different, because there is the different amount of productivity coming out of it. With all of this, with whatever it is that we're doing, however we decide to measure, the goal is we need to learn from experience. And that starts with, we estimate stuff up front, whatever our measurement tool is. We're going to do our best to match that measurement. And essentially, we're going to see what happens. So we're going to track, and we're going to track it. We may provide for surprises and trouble areas and things like that. So when we get done, we're going to look at the metrics, and we're going to say, hey, we slipped a week, but we slipped a week because there's a power outage and everybody lost 5 days of work, or something like that. Or it could be that, oh yeah, there was this extra requirement that came up that nobody estimated, and we know that took at least 2 weeks to get that done, and that's why we're behind. It's things like that. So your estimation is going to vary even from project to project. When they look like the same project, there's just going to be circumstances will be a little different. Environment will be a little different. Things happen. Life happens. If you can, it's really useful to actually compare against others, like other companies, other developers, industry standards. If it's out there, is sort of figure out whatever that metric is. What is the typical amount of work produced by an average developer in a certain area? And there are some of these, like about how many functions are they typically going to be able to do? How many lines of code are they typically able to create? How many and they usually move it up a level. So it'd be things like how many data entry forms, or how many database tables, or how many fully validated, how many reports can they generate, stuff like that. There's going to be some sort of a metric out there that hopefully, even if your metric is not quite the same, you can do a little bit of comparison enough to say, oh, okay, this, I'm above average, I'm average, I'm below average, and see where you sit. And then over time, you want to see, hopefully that you're sitting in a better position, that you're doing better, that you are improving along the way. And again, just beware with whatever you use. This is going to be a little bit of sticking your finger up in the wind kind of thing, just to figure it out, because whatever approach you use, however you use it, however you measure it, it may vary. Maybe best to vary it from project to project, environment to environment. Some environments, it may turn out that lines of code actually works really well. Some environments, it's going to be completely useless. Some environments, maybe hours works really well. Other environments, completely useless. You're going to find that with just about every one of these metrics. There's some cases where it just doesn't fit. If you're writing scripts and there's really no functions, then function points are going to be pretty tough to do, unless you almost have to move it to like a file level metric, and that again may be very deceiving. So that being said, if I'm coming into a project, what do I do? How do I, I've got all this stuff. None of it sounds like it's really, there's no silver bullet here. So what do I do? Well, the first thing you got to figure out is what really is your goal in measuring. What is your goal in putting this metric together? Your goal may be that you need a lot of code generated. And this could be valid where it's like, I think so. There's some offshore companies that do this where it's just, they've got some pretty cheap resources that are just able to crank out code. They give them very specific requirements. They give them a whole pile of stuff that needs to be done that's really just writing code. It's not even, a lot of cases, you don't even have to think about it a whole lot. You just have to write the code. And in a case like that, maybe generating code is really all you need. So lines of code could be a really valid measure. A good example of that, a real world example we used years and years ago, which still gives me a little bit of a laugh every time I think about it, is we had a high school programming team that the first year we ended up, you take 4 people, and we went and we ended up in second place. And so the next year we looked at it, we were done. And what was happening is you had one keyboard, you had one computer, and then basically what ended up happening is we had 20 different problems or something like that. So you'd have somebody programming, and then you'd have somebody, the other 3 people be writing notes down on notebook paper, sort of like pseudo coding their way into it. Well, the second year we went into it, because the first year we realized that we had half of our problems were just sitting on the desk. We hadn't been able to enter them in. We found somebody that knew a little bit of code and could type like you wouldn't believe. I mean, most of us were maybe, 40 or 50 words a minute kind of typers at best. This girl was 80 or 90 words a minute. She could fly, and she knew enough about the code that she wasn't necessarily the best programmer, but she could crank code out like nobody's business. We took first place because we basically got everything typed in. The 3 programmers or developers basically didn't write a line of code. She cranked all of it out, did all the testing, the compiling, and all that kind of stuff, and we blew away the next team. So there's valid use of that. a complete product is normally going to be your goal. I mean, there's steps to get to that complete product, milestones and stuff like that. But normally, you're not just in there to just like write code. You're not just in there to process stuff. You're in there to get to some product, either that you can sell or that you can have your employees use, whatever it is. Your goal might also be to create features, because maybe it's really sort of like in between those two, is that you've got a product, but it's not complete. There's new requests. There's like reports or new functionality or new navigation or new links or stuff like that. That maybe it's the features, and so depending on those, that's going to vary quite a bit. What metric makes more sense to you? Complete product, the function point thing may or may not work for you. Because it may be, unless you've got all of those functions lined up, then you may not be able to properly balance them out. If you need a complete product, then lines of code probably isn't going to do anything for you, unless the complete product, when we're done, this is going to be 500,000 lines of code. We know that. I don't know how you would know that, but if you did, then you'd be able to use that. Not only your goal, but then you have to look at design and the architecture. Depending on what you're building can dramatically impact some of those metrics, particularly these days when you've got code generators and you've got all kinds of shortcuts. Object-oriented stuff really threw off lines of code and function points, because you can have a really good object-oriented design, or you can have a really crappy one, and depending on how you do that, it's going to artificially inflate or deflate your functions and even the lines of code and things like that. So design, the architecture of your product, of your work, is something that you're going to have to take into account when you're trying to select approach. What kind of project is it? There is, depending on what you're doing, the actual like line of business and stuff like that you're in is going to impact a lot of these things as well. If you have to do something that is a financial application, where there's a whole lot of calculations going on and formulas and things like that, that code is going to be very different in size and structure of somebody that's doing like an online sales application. Because then their code is about like registering a customer and maybe checking it out and displaying a product or something like that. So you've got a very different kind of work that's going on. Stuff where a lot of things are roughly, in some way generated out of the database. So, like if it's an online product catalog and you've essentially got like a product page template, and then you've got, you could have 1 million products sitting in your database, but you really only created, whatever that is, let's say 100 lines of code to do your template. And then after that, you've got 1 million pages out there. Well, that's going to be very different from something where you have to go in and what every page or every view that a user sees is like maybe a reporting application. So that would mean every time that you've got a report, there's some core code, maybe not a lot, but there's some code there to build the query or execute the query, to format the data that comes back, things like that. So what kind of project? You got to think about that a little bit. Take all of those into account when you're trying to figure out what works best for this, project. And then the mother of all teachers is your past success and failures. Is where have either I or others that I know, where have they used certain measurement strategies for this kind of project, and it's worked or it's failed. If it's worked, then hey, we can take a look at it because this worked for these people at this time. If it failed, then you probably don't want to repeat their failures. So you don't want to repeat their mistake. Try something else. And it may have to be a combination of that. Maybe you'll see in the past, you'll see all these different measurements used, and there was some success and there was some failure in there as well. So you have to carve your way into it. If you're hearing that there's not a cut and dried method, that's exactly the problem with this. It's a challenge, and it's a little bit personal as well. I think different people work better under different circumstances, and just like the design can impact stuff, the way that you code can impact it. So you're going to have to help yourself out with this. And this is useful even if this is just you doing your little side hustle or something like that, because you are going to have a manager that's going to ask, or a customer that's going to ask you to estimate doing something. That's just part of the business. So as you're going through your career, just as we have a repository of code that we can reuse and problems that we've solved in the past that we can reuse, the tasks that we have done before, it should become sort of automatic to estimate. If I've done this thing or close to it 100 times, I should know by the 101st time roughly how long it's going to take me to do that. And that's part of measuring along the way. If you've never measured, then, or you've never paid attention to the measurements, then you're not going to know. If you are, then probably by the time you do it a third or fourth time, at worst, you're going to be able to say, oh yeah, this takes me 3 days or whatever it is. That becomes incredibly valuable as setting expectations and being able to even get paid properly with, depending on what your situation is, whether you're an employee or a contractor. You need to know the resource. This goes to the difference between a junior for a senior level, but also it's new versus experience in that area, and even including yourself. So maybe you've done this before in C++, but now they're asking you to do essentially the same thing in Java. Well, your estimation is going to be, somewhat pulled from what it took you to do it in C++. I mean, there's going to be, that gives you sort of like a baseline or a foundational number. But now you're in a new environment. So now, maybe you tack a little on, here or there based on, it's slightly different, and it's a new language. I've got, maybe some other things that are impact type features or concerns, that will adjust my numbers. So you need to think about that as well. But hopefully over time, even that will be something where you'll be able to say, well, I've done this before where I've had a problem and I had to learn a new language while I was doing it. And typically it takes me, 10% more time or 20% more time or 50% more time or whatever it is when I do it in a new environment. Well, you can put those modifiers will be part of building your library of estimations that you can provide. There's some other aspects in there that you can think about. The target audience and market very often are going to be a big difference in that. If you're building a little an internal application that Joe down in the mailroom is going to use, you're probably not going to spend as much time refining it and making sure that it's really sweet user experience and stuff like that. If it's the CEO of the company that's going to use it, you're going to spend a lot more time polishing that thing off and making sure all the bells and whistles are awesome and that everything is flawless and the user experience is incredible. And because you're going to have to hide your name somewhere in a couple places to make sure the CEO sees your name all the time, whatever you put into it, that's going to impact as well getting those tasks done. And of course, if you throw it to the outside world, if it's a commercial product, we've talked about that in the past, there's a whole other set of tasks and work that go into every piece really of what you're building. So, suddenly there's going to be some additional time that's going to go into there. And that's the stuff where as you grow as a developer, you become much more valuable to your employers and to your customers, because you're going to be able to walk in and say, oh, yeah, I'm doing this, but because I'm doing this project, here's some other things that are going to be a part of it that you haven't really thought about. It's not just building the project. It's also, there's got to be some testing involved. There's some documentation. There's some technical documentation. There's some training that needs to be done. There's going to be some support time afterwards. There's deployment scripts that need to be built. I need to build a development environment, a production environment, a testing environment, things like that. This is stuff that customers may come to you and say, hey, I need this little thing, and you're like, oh yeah, I can do that, and then you start rattling off all of these other things that are required, and that really changes the expectations, and that's good, because you don't want them coming in thinking, oh, I'm going to lay down $100 and get this application, and $100,000 later, you've got an application and it's not quite what they want. It's better for them to know right away. If they want to plunk $100,000 in, that's great, but make sure that they know that up front. And this problem is far more common, I think, than you would expect, and far more ridiculous at times than you'd expect. I mean, I don't know how many times I have seen project posts where it's, the budget is $250 and they want to build an Amazon clone. They're like, well, basically look at Amazon. I want to build that. Like, no, why would you even think that a company that's been doing this for decades and with thousands of developers, one or two developers can do it for $250? It's stuff like that. Sometimes people just don't quite think it through. And some people will tell them, oh yeah, I'll do that for $250. Well, that person, they're going to end up getting a bad taste in their mouth. So don't be that person. Work on your estimation. Get an understanding of what it is that you do well and what it is that you struggle with, because that's going to be some of those projects. Like maybe you're really good at putting together queries and building reports. Maybe you really struggle with getting JavaScript validation working right. Or, maybe CSS just drives you batty. It takes you a lot of time to get all the little details to get the CSS right. Stuff like that. Everybody's got their strengths and weaknesses. Hopefully, as you're doing your estimations, you're going to learn what your strengths and weaknesses are. And of course, the payoff. We're putting all this thought into this. We're working on this stuff. We're trying to figure all these things out and put these numbers together and offer them up to our boss or our customer. Well, part of the payoff is setting expectations. That is one of the most important, I think, aspects of being successful as a developer. If you can go in and set expectations properly, even if they're disappointed at what the expectations are, setting them properly is going to make your life 1,000 times easier. It's just nobody wants to be in that conversation where they say, I know I estimated this was going to take a week, but I got into it and realized it's actually going to take 6 months. That kind of stuff, just that you don't want to be in that. So be able to set expectations, realistically, and that's going to help you a lot. You're going to have a lot of hard conversations that go away. The difficult conversations are not going to appear as often if you can do that. And of course, part of this, the whole start of this thing, is to measure and improve your ability. Whatever you're doing this year, if you look back, you should be able, if you're doing essentially the same thing or something like it next year, you should be getting it done faster. You should be able to improve over time. And if you've got something that you've been measuring, then your measurements should show that you're getting better. And if you look at professional athletes, they may have let's say like a running back. They'll look at like yards per game that they've run. Yeah, they're going to have some good games and some bad games, but ideally they would be able to generate more yards per game or per carry over time. What you normally find out, of course, in their case is they're not, because they're getting older and they're getting weaker, and it's getting harder to do that. But it is a measurement, and it's one that they'll at least know how they're falling off, or if they make a big change, like quarterbacks, you'll see that sometimes is they'll have a success rate. Their accuracy rate is maybe not real good, and they make a couple changes, and so their accuracy rate just skyrockets because of they've made some improvements. And developers the same way. You may find suddenly that because you make a few changes, your productivity just skyrockets, or your ability to crank out code skyrockets. When you do, embrace it. The estimation is really valuable when you're trying to map out your side hustle. A side hustle kind of thing can be a monumental time suck if you don't watch out. And you can think that you're going to go into something and you're just going to spend an hour here, an hour there, and the next thing you know, it just like consumes your life. Not necessarily that's a bad thing. There's it may be a choice as you're okay with that. Say, hey, I'm going to work 8 hours a day, and I'm going to go back and work another 8 hours a day on my side hustle because I'm going to retire when I'm 30, or something like that. I don't think that's that's probably a different conversation, but there's going to be work you're going to do that is not for necessarily directly for a customer, maybe not for your employer, but because you want to do it, or you're doing it for, friends or family or something like that. If you've got some good estimation skills, that's going to allow you, which is going to be very important to you, to understand what is the actual cost of saying yes to doing whatever this project is. And that has been there too. That's really difficult when you say, oh yeah, I'll help you set up this little website so that you can put pictures of your kid out on the web. And you're thinking, yeah, I'll get that done in 30 minutes. 6 hours later, you're still struggling through that because suddenly the whole, I'm enjoying doing this and being nice to, my relative or neighbor or whatever it is I hate this person because they managed to somehow rope me into this project that will never end. So, proper estimation is going to help you out quite a bit, maybe save a few headaches on your side as well. Because you may say, if you know that it's going to take you 6 to 8 hours to do that instead of a half an hour, then you may either say no, or you'll say, hey, I don't really have the time, or yeah, I can do it, but it's going to be, I'll be able to do a little time here, a little time there, and it's going to take a month before I can get that done. Again, save yourself a few headaches. Critical to all of this stuff actually is figure out what your real rate is. If you know what your time and effort and productivity is going into what you're generating, and you know what you're getting paid to do it, then you can get a better idea of, what's my real value? Am I getting paid essentially $5 an hour for what I'm doing? Or am I getting paid $500 an hour for what I'm doing? There's obviously a lot of reasons that makes sense, that's important to you. And hopefully that's one of those things that over time it's going to get better. If you're getting $5 an hour now, hopefully next year you're earning $6 an hour or $10 an hour, and then, and move your way up to, some incredible number. But those kinds of things, even with a side hustle where you're like creating a product, it's very useful to know that, hey, if I put 500 hours into that product that I created, I know that I put $500 hours into it, and I'm hoping that I'm going to make, enough back to make it worth my while, so that I can say, yeah, I did, but ended up making, $10 an hour out of it, and was able to, it was worth it. And of course, money's not not everything. And a lot of time with those kind of projects, it's, what did you learn? What kind of experience did you get? What are you able to add to your portfolio that came out of that? But at the end of the day, you do want to have some idea of what your rate is, because you want to be paid fair, and you want to be able to, if you go out and you try to consult or do something, you want to be able to ask for a fair rate. So now that we've gone through all of this, I know everybody's just chomping at the bit to say, oh, I want to go start measuring and estimating. And I'm just like, I can't wait. Well, sort of in a challenge kind of mode, look at your week ahead. Set and plan some goals. What are some things that you need to have done? Whether you can set them, or maybe your boss has already set them. Take a look at it. If you haven't already, take a look at it. What's it going to take to get that stuff done? At the end of the, along the way, track your progress. So at the end of the week, take a look at how you did. Estimate, this is what I'm going to do this week. This is what I'm going to get done. How much time I'm going to spend. How much, lines of code or functions or whatever that I'm going to get done. Then, track it along the way and look and see how you did at the end of the week. And then next week, repeat and see where maybe you can make some improvements along the way. For all of these, there are apps for this, pretty much however you want to do it. There are things out there for tracking productivity, for tracking developer effort, things like that. I'm not even going to go into them because there's just so many of them. The simplest ones are the timers that are out there where you just click a button, it'll turn it on. When you're done, click a button and turn it off. I highly recommend that one actually, is just do like a, Pomodoros, or even just like a little, clock or something like that, so that you, in a given day, when you sit down and you start writing code or working, whatever it is you're doing, hit the start button. And then when you're done, when you step away or for whatever reason, hit the stop button. When you get to the end of the day, look at how many hours of work you actually put in. It's a very eye-opening experience to do that. And especially over time, it's critical so that you don't end up in a situation where you basically sign yourself up for 16 hours of work a day, and historically you've never worked more than 8 hours a day, because that's just that's a no-win situation. That's not going to work out well. So final thoughts, you can use lines of code, you can use function points, you can use hours, you can use tickets, you can use pretty much whatever you want. Milestones, you can set all kinds of goals. There's a lot of different ways to measure. Most of those are going to require some amount of overhead. It may be as simple as a pencil and paper or a little spreadsheet or something like that, but you're going to have to spend at least a little time thinking about, tracking down the estimates and the time or the effort that went into them, actually getting your measurement against whatever the tasks are that you're doing or the product that you're building. So, just bake that into your understanding. If I'm going to work 40 hours a week and I'm going to do this, well, I'm actually going to work like, 38 and a half hours a week or something, because I'm going to take 10 minutes a day or 15 minutes a day having to deal with this administrative overhead. Just make sure that you understand that. The value in all this stuff, it just comes back down to practice, practice, practice. Estimate, and then see how you did. Estimate, see how you did. Estimate, see how you did. The better you get, the more value you are, and the more you're going to be sort of unique among developers, as there are a lot of developers out there that can't estimate their way out of a paper bag. And it's well known. And maybe that your estimates are always a certain way, but if you know that, like whatever your first estimate is, you double it, and that usually ends up to be correct, well then good, because now you have a proper estimate. So you may have to put some modifiers in, you may have to monkey with your numbers, but if you know what it takes to monkey with your numbers to get to the right estimate, something that's pretty close to the real number, then that's hugely valuable. And that's, again, like I said, there's a lot of places they would kill to have somebody come in and be able to properly estimate the work and the effort and the time for their development team to get stuff done. At this point, I will open it up for questions, comments.
Yeah, I actually wanted to mention something where you talked about the hours of effort, like that don't spend too much time on a problem. I had that come up. I was working on a coding challenge and just banging my head against the wall. I couldn't get past it. So I ended up staying up until like midnight. Had to be at work at 7 o'clock in the morning. So I put it down, and then I just went to work the next day, and it just kind of came to me. I kind of got a couple different ideas being away from that problem. I got home from work and solved it in like 10 minutes. So that's one thing, like, to what you said about that. It's very true. It works for me. And then I also wanted to mention, like, kind of goes with that is like having multiple goals. For instance, like the other day, I had to fill out some answers in order to get into the group project that I was doing. And I was kind of stuck on it. I wasn't sure how to answer like 2 of them. So it was kind of slowing me down on all of them. And I just wasn't feeling it. And I usually meet up every Wednesday for like a group run with some people. And I didn't want to do that. I ended up going anyways, set a new record for my 5K. And like that win turned around and kind of lifted me up. And the next day I was able to go in and answer the questions and felt pretty confident turning them in. So kind of having different wins in different areas can boost you up in the areas where you're having more troubles at that time.
Yeah, that's we've mentioned that before. We've talked about that a little bit, I think, and maybe in some other conversations. But that's actually that's one of those like keys to success kind of things, is to have a couple of tracks going on at a time, so that when you bang your head against the wall in one thing, you've sort of got something else you can fall back to, so you don't feel like you're not doing anything, or that you're not getting something done, but you're doing something that you needed to do anyways, and that allows you to get away from that problem. And in like your case, sometimes it's you sort of get on a roll. You're like really successful doing that other thing, and then when you come back, suddenly it works out really well. And honestly, like a workout, going for a walk is often recommended, but if you're a bike rider or a runner or something like that, there's a lot of times that I will do, because I don't have a set schedule for when I'll go do a workout. And so I do a couple times a week, but a lot of times I'll do is it'll be, I'll hit a wall and I'll just be sitting there staring at something. I'm like, you know what? I need to just go do that. And I just get away for a while and, put the headphones on, listen to some music or something like that. And it's inevitably something will come to me, and it may not be the right solution, but it'll be something where at least I'll have tried some more things and, be able to move further down the road. Because sometimes it's like writer's block. You sort of get to a point where you're just like, I don't know what to do next. And you find yourself sort of spinning your wheels.
Well, it's amazing going, from one day to another day, how much your thought process can change going into something. So sometimes, the best time management thing you can do is walk away from something and just come back to it when you're feeling more refreshed, or if you're having a less frustrating day. It makes a huge difference, man. I can't work frustrated. I end up it gets worse and worse, but I can run and I can lift weights as frustrated as can be because it just gets all that out. So yeah, there's definitely good to have outlets.
Exactly. Good point. Other questions, comments?
How can you tell, looking at the code, like this is mediocre code, this is good code? Okay, bad code, I know it's you're going to get bugs, but from your experience, how can you look into the code and you say, oh, no, this is too mediocre, or it's maybe it's good code?
Yeah, I look at the top, and if it says it was written by me, awesome code. If it said it was written by Michael, really crappy code. No,
Watch it.
That's that's really a good question. I am actually going to pitch that over to Michael here in a second. Personally, yeah, it's almost like how do you know, like, good art or something like that? It's not quite that tough to discern it, because there are things like there's certain, like, patterns you'll see where, like, logic is not fully thought out, or the names used are confusing. The code itself maybe doesn't have, like, a flow to it, so you'll see that they're sort of like tackling one thing and then they go off and tackle something else and they come back and tackle a different thing, so that within the code it's like the code's sort of switching gears a lot. And then it's sometimes just the verbosity. There'll be just a very brute force method of solving a problem, and you'll look at it and you'll see that, this could be done much easier. Like, a good example would be if you look at code and you see, like, basically the same sections of code over and over again, you're going to look at it and say, well, they should probably have that, like, pulled out to a function somewhere, or that should be in a loop or something like that. So there's some things like that it's hard to, I think, as a human being, when you look at it, you probably have somewhere in your head that you're actually walking through a list of things that make for good code or bad code, that you're sort of checking those off as you look at it. But I don't know that everybody could, actually produce that list if somebody asked them about it. And of course, that may just be me, and that's why I do want to throw that one to Michael, because I know he's done a lot of the same. We spent a lot of time doing, like, tech reviews and stuff like that. So see what he thinks about that question.
Yeah, can you guys hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I had to turn the mic sensitivity down for the dogs. One of the big things nowadays with a lot of projects I come on is, one, if it's a contract job, you got to be very conscious of the time for the task. So you don't want to waste time really refactoring too much of the code. You want to get the job done, meet the customer's needs, get it out. However, there's some common things I look for in almost everything I do anymore, especially Java related, and even C# and some of the other languages. One of the big things is, like, within a for loop. Don't declare your variables inside of a for loop. That's a huge memory gap, because you're basically, if you have a loop that creates 1,000 objects, well, you now have 1,000 objects in memory till it decides to garbage collect. Little things like that I'll quickly pull out. Subtle things like make sure you're using ints instead of longs or doubles and floats. Just subtle things like that are very quick wins that you can do as you're coding on the fly. Other things like code refactoring, if you have the time to do something like that, one of the biggest things I've done in the last 4 years is the first thing I'll do when I come into a project, if they basically know their code's crap or they've had a lot of people working on the project and they know there's going to be a bit of rewrite and refactoring. One of the things I initially do is I look for like common functions or common pieces of code. So I'll create like a utility or I'll create like a parent class and move a lot of the common functionality up into like the parent classes, and then I extend where it's appropriate. I use interfaces now a lot more than I did in the past, which then you essentially include or extend classes that include certain inheritance. So you're only passing around, you're only showing what's necessary. So you're not basically wasting a lot of code being in memory. Another big one right now, though, it's going to kind of be a bit of a game changer when you go to Java 9 is Jigsaw. You really are going to have to start being kind of modular in thought and how you're going to package and deploy your applications. And a lot of that comes with what I've been talking about the last few classes with the containers. That's kind of the direction Java went. It's like, hey, let's basically treat Java the way it should be. Let's get it back to basically lock down the core functionality of it, and let's make it work more for what containers are. So basically you're packaging and deploying only the pieces of code that you need. You don't need to package and deploy additional libraries that may have been included from some third party but aren't actually used, so you don't actually have to package those and send those. So those are just some things to think about as you're actually going through on different projects.
Okay. Other questions or comments? All right. So, wrapping it up, we've now, after going through all of this, there's a number of ways that you can estimate software. If you look back now, we're an easy 60, 70 years, 80 years into this, probably at least a good 40 or 50 that we've been trying to estimate software, and we still haven't really nailed it. I don't know any companies that have. If you look at stuff that's out there and magazines and articles and stuff like that, there's still all kinds of debate over what works and what doesn't, and whether it's good or not, and all of that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of options out there. It's a personal choice, I think, in a sense, for yourself to be able to see how you're doing, to sort of rank your way as you go, and give yourself some meaningful goals. So, find something that works for you. Each path's got strengths and weaknesses. Take a look at what those strengths and weaknesses are. Again, you may just have to do a little research on them, but hopefully their strengths and weaknesses will work well to match what you need out of a measurement approach. Different projects are going to have different fits too. So, it may be that what you do, and actually that's a lot of how I sort of measure stuff is, Java sort of webbish kind of projects that I do, I measure in a very different way from progress on PHP web kind of projects, which I measure very different from Java Swing applications, which I measure very different from C# web apps. Whatever I'm doing, the projects sort of dictate a little bit how I'm going to do some estimation and measurement as well. Nothing's perfect. That's the nice thing about it is you're not going to, I don't know, there is no right answer necessarily. I'm not sure. There may be a couple that are probably pretty wrong answers, but even then, not in all cases. So, you may find that what works for you, and it may not work for anybody else. And that's okay. At the end of the day, as long as you can use that in some way to translate to others what it's going to take to get the job done, then, you get to mark that off as success. As always, thank you for your time. I do appreciate listening to this one. This one's gone probably a little longer than some of our others, so I appreciate even more than we normally have your time. And if you have any questions, love to get further into this. This is always a challenging kind of thing to discuss. Everybody's got different experiences, so there's a lot to be learned in those kinds of discussions. As always, if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, jokes, limericks, you name it, send it to info@developernoir.com. A contact form, contact us out on developernoir.com, @developernoir on Twitter, developernoir Facebook page. And as always, hey, we're just out there trying to make every developer better, including ourselves. So have a great one.